until this evening that this lecture series has actually been going on and off since the late 1980s. So it's wonderful to have this third lecture in person after having 2 years virtual. So thank you all for coming out, especially on a cold evening. We're really happy to be here. I wanted just a couple of housekeeping things. If you feel like you want to move your chairs around to give yourself more space, feel free to do that. And the washrooms are just down the hall on the left. There's 2 all-gender washrooms there. So if you need to go to the washroom at any time, feel free to. The door's a little sticky, so be sure to give it a good pull when you come back in. As we gather today, it's important for us to acknowledge the history, spirituality, culture, and rights of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from coast to coast to coast, who have called this land home since time immemorial, and who continue to experience the ongoing effects of colonialism and systemic racism. This acknowledgement is nothing without action to back it up, and I encourage all of us to think about how each of us, in our own way, can actively honor and uphold our obligations as treaty people. As John Joe Sark told me this morning, it's not reconciliation, it's reconciliation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bren Simmers. I'm the managing editor of Island Studies Press, and the press is part of the Institute and has been publishing books about island culture, environment, economy for over 37 years. And for those of you who don't know about the Institute of Island Studies, maybe there's a couple of you who haven't heard about us, we are a research, education, and public policy institute located literally just down the hall. And if you're curious about what we do, check us out on islandstudies.com. We have an incredible monthly newsletter that is like chock full of all news about islands. So I'll be passing around this sign-up sheet if you want to put your email on that. We don't give it to anyone else, I promise. So be sure to put your email on that if you're interested. But enough of me talking, I would like to introduce our guest lecturer. We're very pleased, excited, delighted, thrilled to have Dr. Ed MacDonald with us. And while he likely needs no introduction, for those of you who don't know him, Ed is a beloved history professor at UPI. And among his 11 books are The Summer Trade, A History of Tourism on Prince Edward Island, which is co-authored with Helen Hunt, and If You're Strong-Hearted, Prince Edward Island in the 20th Century. He is also co-author of Time and a Place, An Environmental History of Prince Edward Island, and The Greater Gulf, Essays on the Environmental History of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. His lecture today is entitled Enshrined, Island Tourism and the Confederation Story. Please welcome Dr. Ed MacDonald.
Thank you for coming out to give the house a good name. We spent about 45 minutes today trying to get the technology to work, and it has just reverted back to what Bobby didn't like this afternoon. So I was going to play you some film. We'll try it once. If it doesn't work, the lecture will work fine without it. But I did want to show you a silent movie from 1925. One of the earliest bits of film about the island on record. But we don't have to worry about that. Today my topic is Enshrined, Island Tourism and the Confederation Story. So I've lectured about that story, the Confederation story, before, and I've lectured before in tourism, but I don't think I've ever given a lecture about the two of them brought together. And I think we should begin by saying that there's nothing inevitable about the island being the birthplace of Confederation. It's not like it was fated to happen. It's not even that it was widely accepted that there was a birthplace of Confederation and that we were it. What happened was a process of sacralization. Sacralization, which is an anthropological term that I stole for this lecture because it applies to tourism. So, just as these individuals are arguing about who is the true father of our Confederation, we have made a claim to be the birthplace of Confederation. We used to be the Cradle of Confederation, which I thought was nicer. It was alliterative. It implied that something was cradled here as opposed to a birth here. However, for reasons that our senator could explain, it's the Birthplace of Confederation. The lecture is based on a book that I'm duly required to advertise, called The Summer Trade. I've listed my co-author as co-author of this talk, partly so that I can blame him if you don't like anything that I say. But we also want to thank our colleague, Matt McRae, who's done quite a bit of work on this as a commemoration theme. And he's not here this evening for me to thank in person, but I thought if I didn't thank him, sure enough, he'd be in the audience and be ticked off at me. But Matt has done some really lovely work on this as a topic academically. And we're grateful to him. So, this is divided into various parts. This one is called Shriners, and I did borrow a Shriner hat. Here is a postcard image of the Provincial building, or the Parliament building, as it was known until fairly recently. And of course, it is now regarded as a national shrine, as well as their legislature. And this is an engraving of Province House, which appeared in London in the Illustrated London News the year that we were the host of the Charlottetown Conference. And it was here, in red ink, that the delegates agreed in principle to a confederation of the colonies if satisfactory terms could be reached. I've been preaching this to Colin Beck and other people for quite a long time now. That is why, that is the basis for the argument that this is the Cradle of Confederation, or the Birthplace of Confederation. As I've said before, if we're going to be strictly honest, we should be calling it the conception place of Confederation, and which was probably much more fun than to be the birthplace. At the banquet that ended the conference, one of the attendees at the banquet, who was not a delegate here, but he was at the conference in Quebec that October, in making a toast, said something which was a bit of a prophecy. Never was such an important meeting as this held before in the history of British America, and it may be said that here in Little Prince Edward Island was that Union foreign which has produced one of the greatest nations on the face of God's earth. Enough said, Mr. Haviland. Guess what Fathers of Confederation did on their day off? Well, some of them went to the circus. Don't spoil it. They played tourist. So they were at a conference, like the Shriners, and on their day off, many of them went to the North Shore by buggy to shoot and to enjoy the surf and the salt air. So they were tourists. Their negotiations, in turn, would become the source of tourism. Now, I'm going to have a little quiz at the end to see if you can name all of the Fathers of Confederation and separate them from the two people who are not. They're the secretaries. So we won't come back to that. Of course, there's one fly in the ointment, as you know, for PEI, or Charlottetown being the birthplace of Confederation, and that is that, in fact, we voted overwhelmingly to stay out of Confederation and did not join Confederation until 1873 because we had financial problems. This is not an actual quote from history. This is going to come back and be an obstacle to the campaign for us to be officially named the birthplace of Confederation. We did have monkeys with the circus and tricks, dogs and ponies, but no elephants. So, did anybody care what was the birthplace of Confederation for the first 25 or 30 or 40 years? No, actually, it wasn't a big deal. I know Alan and I did a search in the paper to see when the term Cradle of Confederation or the birthplace of Confederation started to be used. Not until about 1906. And so it's not until the 50th anniversary of the conference that the government and citizens of the city started saying, you know, we're really the cradle of Confederation. This should be worth something. So I have adjusted this stamp accordingly, 1864 to 1914. And at the public meeting at the end of 1913, where there was an official kind of deliberation and a motion to celebrate the anniversary, there were quotes, and I won't read them because we'll be here all evening if I read everything on the PowerPoint, and you're always told, don't read what's on the PowerPoint, because the audience can read that. But you can see, we just thought, well, naturally we should be doing this. What could be more appropriate? Where the first sod was turned, the first word was spoken, where the foundation of the Dominion was laid. And then they said, actually, lots of people would come here. It would be a good tourist event. And they don't say, and we could get federal money. So here is the headline from the Guardian, Golden Jubilee of Confederation. This is the first attempt to brand us as the birthplace of Canada, or I should say of Confederation. As the Guardian said, the coming year is our opportunity, in all caps. So they appointed a committee. It was headed by an individual who had been the premier and become a judge. They even issued a promotional stamp with the worst ever map of PEI. Drawn, actually it was done by a McGinnis from Summerside, from the Summerside Journal. It looked like it was drawn by his 3-year-old child. Federal government even came up with $20,000. $20,000 to fund the event. And it was going to be held in August 1914. Bad timing, because the First World War erupted, so even as Carter and company was advertising flags, fireworks, everything you needed to celebrate, the Guardian was announcing Confederation, the celebration postponed. In fact, it didn't happen. Nothing happened. And all that we got out of it was a lousy plaque. Not a t-shirt, but a plaque. The plaque that you've seen in Province House, by the same person who designed the monument to the Boer War, which is a far better piece of sculpture than this is, but it was put on the wall in Province House, in the Hearts and Minds, blah, blah, blah. They built it better than they knew. So, the first attempt to brand us as the birthplace was abortive because of a world war. In the interwar years, the Confederation theme started to gather some momentum. By this time, the island had discovered what its marketing themes were. Pastoral landscape and a people who fit that image, who provided an alternative from urban kind of industrial angst. An escape to an island across water, if in fact you could get here. The island as a literary shrine, because even by the 1920s, Anne is big business. And Charlottetown as the cradle of Confederation. Now, this brings us to this theory about site sacralization, with an extra quotation mark there for some reason. So, these are the stages, or this is the process. First, you have to identify what the shrine is. So it's the naming or the marking of the site. Then you frame and elevate it. In other words, you promote the idea. You can call that branding if you want. Enshrinement, where you tell the story about why this is such an important thing. And then it passes through 2 stages where you start to merchandise it. You sell souvenirs. You sloganize it. And then finally, the broader community starts to use it. They start to buy into the idea that it is the birthplace. So, There are other candidates, admittedly, for being the birthplace of Confederation. Fredericton, although that's only recently, and that was somewhat abortive. They were trying to campaign, their tourism campaign in 2017 was the place, I think the place where it all began. Because the governor decided to organize a conference that turned into the, well, that's a non-starter. That's not even in any kind of ink color. Charlottetown, where the conference was and there was agreement in principle. Halifax, which bizarrely has claimed to be part of the birthplace because, you know, the meeting adjourned there, although they didn't do anything in Halifax. Quebec, okay, Quebec is a pretty good one, because that's where the terms of Confederation were negotiated, which became the basis of, you know, the DNA Act. Luckily for us, Quebec has never been interested in being the birthplace of Canada. And then, if you're a purist, London, because the DNA Act, which created the Dominion of Canada, is actually an act of Parliament of Britain. So, has London really cared? No. Do they know where Canada is? Sort of, yes. North of the United States. So, this is who we're competing against in trying to brand ourselves. And in 1925, forerunner of the NFB created a film, a tourism promotional film called The Cradle of Confederation about the island. This is the second oldest film footage that I know of Prince Edward Island. And the highlight of the film, and it's a great film, I would show you the whole thing, it's 7 minutes long. They arrive by train and they drive to Fairholme and they go to Beach Grove and various other places, and they visit Old Home Week, which was being held for the first time since 1905, I believe. But the highlight of the film is their visit to the Confederation Chamber. And this is where, if the technology worked, which I'm doubtful it will, we can actually see this. Yeah, no, it's not going to work, and we know why, we just don't know how to fix it. Well, I can play it here, but you can't see it. So, trust me, there's a film. And it's very exciting. It's got, you know, captions, and they drive by car right up to the door of Province House. And this is a still taken from the film of their, you know, admiring the plaque.
And all the women with you?
Actually, this is a very empowering film. It's two women. They're met by a woman driving a car. This is 1925, only 6 years after the last of the restrictions on having automobiles was lifted. Fitzroy Street doesn't look quite the same. It's not paved, for one thing. Anyway, the epicenter for the birthplace story is the Room of Destiny. The Confederation Chamber, otherwise known as the Legislative Council Chamber, which the council itself was abolished in 1893, and this room had been used as a storeroom, but now was elevated to the status of an important place where they made the country, where history happened. So this is a photograph probably from the 1930s, which you can see the plaque, which is in the restored Province House, I think going to be back still on the first floor, but in those days it was actually in the Confederation Chamber. But the next really big opportunity to promote us as the Cradle of Confederation is 1939, the 75th anniversary of the conference in Charlottetown, and once again the government and the Tourism Publicity Association made a major effort to stage a major event. And they even had a special edition of the Maritime Advocate. This is the cover, showing the Confederation Chamber. They got $20,000 from Ottawa, although Ottawa was a little reluctant to to give money to what they thought of as a local event. And so they conceded that because everyone had to travel through parts of the country to get to Prince Edward Island, if you gave money for the event, it would promote the tourism industry in the Maritimes in general. So a specious argument, but we got $20,000. And the highlight, well, there was a parade, and we have astonishingly photographs from a photo album of a person who was at the parade, but we also have the program for the tableau that was staged that evening, The Romance of Canada, which featured 200 actors and all of them amateurs and 8,000 spectators. And we wanted the Prime Minister there. We didn't get the Prime Minister or the Governor General, but we got about a quarter of the cabinet, a bunch of premiers, and assorted MPs and senators. Here are some shots of the parade. This is the PEI float in the parade. It's like Old Home Week all over again. I won't deconstruct the float. It is politically incorrect. It shows Jacques Cartier and the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq are local actors in brown face. Here's a parade of people in ye olde costumes, because these are not historically appropriate. You could tell it was a windy day. This is, I can't remember what this is. It's a local float, though. This is the New Brunswick float for you, Lydia. And there's Ontario. A lot of this was captured in film footage, and again, I had this clip I was going to play for you. One of the highlights of the week was the unveiling of historic plaques approved by the HSMB for the Island Fathers of Confederation. And there's a newsreel showing the unveiling, the ceremony, and the descendants of the fathers from PEI all come out and they pull aside a little flag, revealing the plaque to their ancestor. But the star of the event was Margaret Gray Lord, who was not only alive, she remembered the Charlottetown Conference because her father was the chair. He was the premier at the time. Anyway, if the film footage would work, I was going to show you her being completely unself-conscious and glorying in the moment. She has the big opening. Great success. What else happened in 1939? They just got it in before the Second World War started. And so, unlike 14, this actually managed to make a national imprint on the imagination. So, why am I showing you a big hole in the ground? This is where I live. This is the Dominion building under construction. Except, when it was built in the mid-1950s, it wasn't going to be called the Dominion building. It was going to be called the Confederation building, because we were slowly making headway in convincing the rest of the country that Charlottetown is the birthplace of Confederation. So you can see the story unfolding in postcards. Pre-World War I, these are just the provincial buildings. Here, after the Second World War, you have a postcard saying, Province House, home of Confederation, and postcards of the Confederation Chamber. There's the Dominion building. There were protests about naming it that, not because it was inappropriate, but because people wishing to build a new arts center wanted to preserve the name for the Arts Center, which later became the Confederation Center of the Arts. But this is a photograph of the Dominion building. I could show you, I used to live in an apartment on the 4th floor, but I'm on the other side of the building now. Also, as tourism gathered momentum, the 50s is the breakthrough era for tourism in PEI. You go from about 40,000 people a year coming in 1950 to 250,000 a decade later. And increasingly they're coming to Province House, because Province House, as it's now starting to be called, has become a tourist attraction because it is the place where the Confederation was born. But they don't have a guide. That's actually the commissionaire, a crusty old Scot named Robert Craig, and the genial guide, they called him in the newspaper, and he did the spiel. Now, you may have noticed, some of you who are older, that the 1960s were a period of centennials, and in an earlier book I coined the phrase centennialitis. A mild affliction, and it lasted about a decade, from 1964 until 1973, because we had first the centennial of the Charlottetown Conference, and then of Canada, and then of our entry into the Confederation as a province. And this is perhaps the moment when the country agrees, when the public at large agree in Canada that Charlottetown is the birthplace of Confederation. There's a commemorative album, Folk Songs for the Four Founding Provinces. This shows you the logo from '64. My sister Helen's the only one that's old enough to remember that. Look how much money they got. $100,000 from the Centennial Commission. We were grandfathered into the Centennial Commission. $420,000 being spent by the province, compared to $20,000 just in 1939, and that all came from Ottawa. Here's the placemat, suggesting that Prince Edward Island was now the cradle of Confederation, not just the Chamber of Destiny, not just Province House, not just Charlottetown, but Prince Edward Island. A commemorative coin from the Public Archives. And on the flip side is this newfangled building that improbably had been dreamed into being by Eric Harvey and Frank McKinnon. This is a token, PI, Birthplace of Canada. Technically not, but here's Eric Harvey and Frank McKinnon, the principal at the college, at Prince of Wales College. Eric Harvey, a philanthropist and wealthy oilman from Alberta, a lawyer by trade. And they convinced the province to pay for the upkeep of a memorial building if it could be built, not knowing how much that was actually going to cost. And in fact, I doubt that they thought that the project would ever come to be. But they convinced the Prime Minister of Canada, here he is, the Dief, to pay 1/2 the cost of the construction of the buildings if the provinces could be convinced to ante up the other half. A 50-50 split. Except for Prince Edward Island, which was going to supply the site on Queen Square and the upkeep after construction. And amazingly, they did it. And I've lectured on this before and published, in fact, a book on it. Here are the contributions based on the population of Canada: 15 cents per capita, 2.7 million, just about 2.8 million, including the money from the feds, $5.6 million. A lot of money in 1964. And it was constructed on time, just barely. Here's the maquette of the building, right by Province House, the birthplace of Confederation's shrine. And here it is. We could talk at length about the brutalist style, the quality of the washrooms, which is really why the Confed Center will never close. It has 3 washrooms in the city. It's financial trouble, but it was an enormous achievement. And it is the Fathers of Confederation memorial buildings. There is a library, there was an archive in the building, there was a gallery, and there was a theater. Hank has graced with his skills over the years. For a little city of 18,000 people, the finest arts center east of Montreal. Why? Because it's the birthplace of Confederation. And they were very conscious, the architects were very conscious of the historic building alongside the modern building. It is lined up exactly on an axis with Province House if you stand in Memorial Hall, which is the actual entry that nobody ever uses because you can't park right in front of it. And Islanders believe it's in their Charter of Rights to park directly in front of whatever building you plan to enter. You know you've made it when you have your own stand. So I decided this morning that I would graphically show this expansion of the concept of the birthplace, not drawn to scale. So you go from the Confederation Chamber to the building being the Cradle of Confederation, to Charlottetown being the Cradle of Confederation, to by 1964 the whole province claiming to be the Cradle of Confederation. And it must be because Lauren Kalbeck named his book, which was a history of the province of Prince Edward Island, the Cradle of Confederation. And even though there's only a chapter in the book on the conference, oh, this is a slide that I thought I added but hadn't, the fold out, inside there's a gatefold with the photograph of the fathers and they're all identified. So why are we buying this book? Why is the island important? Apparently only because we are the Cradle of Confederation. Well, we won't have time to get into the backlash against that in 1973. There is going to be a backlash that the history of PEI is far more important to Islanders than that one kind of cameo role in the national story. But if anybody in Canada knows anything about the island, what do they know about us? Home of Anna Green Gables. There are potatoes. And it's the Cradle of Confederation. But lobster capital of the world is Shediac, so we can't claim that the lobster is anything. Ultimately, we can claim, mussels. Here is Centennialitis Part 2. I had to divide it in half. Mechanical reproduction. Now you start getting products capitalizing on being the Cradle of Confederation. And I'm just marking the escalation in spending. In 1973, the spending was $2.5 million. We're getting the hang of it. Even create a license plate. The place to be in 73, which worked great in 1973, but when you keep your license plate, it doesn't rhyme after that. So you're still the place to be in 1975. There's a whiskey decanter, created by the Hudson's Bay Company, with a smiling father, and the logo from 1973. Canadian Mint produces a $1 coin. Mike, I don't know if you gave me one of those. I can't remember. But at this point, Province House is the provincial legislature, and the government has had trouble looking after the provincial legislature. This is a postcard showing you how sooty and blackened the walls are. People will remember that if you grew up around town. From car exhaust and the Maritime Electric Plant. So the government started charging admission to go to the Confederation Chamber. And the Premier's files are full of letters from Canadians complaining that you shouldn't have to pay to go to see a national shrine. Canadians should not have to pay to see the birthplace of Confederation. Free access should be the right of us all. A 50-cent charge, while small, is a slap in the face. Now, other letters did complain there's nothing to see there. I paid 50 cents and it was like a room with some chairs now. They were at least expecting an animated John A. MacDonald. Anyway, so Premier Campbell thought he had pulled off a tremendous coup when he convinced the government of Canada to take over Province House while allowing our legislature to continue to meet there. Not knowing that Islanders would be rather insulted that we were going to be renting our legislature from Ottawa. When you think of it that way, he was passing on the cost of maintaining the building, but giving up ownership turned out to be a non-starter, and ultimately they worked out a leasing agreement where the federal government leases the building from the province, which meant they had to pay for the renovation, and are paying the current renovation rather than the province. Phase 4. This is going faster than I thought. This is good. but I thought this was going to be like an hour and a half. Ramping up and doubling down. So this is the period after 1973, which is admittedly a high point. In 1989, another suitably round kind of number. Again, totally for touristic reasons, we had a festival of the Descendants. And each of the people who could prove they were a descendant of one of the fathers of Confederation was given a commemorative coin. Or I guess it's a medallion. I got one, but only because I was on the advisory committee. Although secretly, I am related to a father, just not very closely. Or legally. But, be that as it may, I was on the advisory committee, and the main event that year was the Festival of the Descendants, and it was a big success. The idea that the benefits of being the cradle of Confederation, or the birthplace, was too limited to downtown Charlottetown was one of the prompts behind a royal commission which released its report in 1991, for which I was the secretary, as I recall. Well, I do recall. Powerful dreams, powerful... I'm sorry, yeah, I got it reversed. Memories and dreams. They're quoting a speech by Joe Gibbs, who was a passionate Canadian nationalist. And he wanted us to explore how to capitalize on being the birthplace of Canada, or the Confederation, and how to spread the benefits of that, to broaden, to deepen the appeal of our status as the birthplace of Confederation. So now the question wasn't, is Charlottetown the birthplace, but how to maximize that status. We don't have to prove it anymore, it's proven. And one of the benefits that's listed in the report is expanded tourism. So, this leads to all kinds of things, but one of the things that it leads to is social reproduction. The community at large starts naming things for Confederation. In fact, if it's not named after Anne of Green Gables in the 1980s and 90s, it is named for Confederation. The Confederation Trail, which seems sort of appropriate, because how did we get to be a province of Canada? We built a railway that we couldn't afford, had to sue Canada to allow us into Confederation and relieve our debt, and the railway became the Confederation Trail. So it did lead to Confederation. So this may lead from one end of the island to the other, but actually it leads to Ottawa. You name vessels, the Confederation. Now, the earliest one is in 1962, so this is an example again of this social reproduction. But then in the 1980s or 1990s, you have the MV Confederation. Not the one that went on fire, the one that broke down and was out of commission. When we created a park out of a landfill oil tank farm in 1995, it seemed only natural that it would be called the Confederation Landing Park. When we finally got the fixed link that we've been asking for since 1885, it was only in 1985 that Ottawa made a decision they wanted us to have a fixed link. Until then, we couldn't seem to get one. After that, we couldn't seem to not get one. Islanders, I think, initially suggested it be called Adequate Crossing, but it was named the Confederation Bridge, probably because Ottawa felt this was proof that they were finally fulfilling one of the terms of Confederation. We're still figuring on the coinage. I did not personally have one of these $250 silver kilo coins, but Province House is on it, although it looks more like the one in Halifax. We get back on the license plate. In fact, Province House, Birthplace of Confederation on your license plate. PEI is the first, one of the provinces in Canada, possibly the first territory, state, or province in North America to put advertising on their license plate in the late 1920s. This piece of advertising is one of the options that people had, so that anywhere we drive in